And now on Radio 4, it's time for this week's profile with Chris Bowlby.
Let me show you this photo. That's Andrew, 16.
We're looking at a picture of him sitting very proudly with the driver door open, a Lotus that looks like it could go very, very fast.
Indeed.
How had he got hold of this?
He was given an ex gratia payment by the government, a one-off payment, because nobody thought that the haemophiliacs were going to live very long. The parents all let them spend the money on what they wanted.
Enjoy it while you can.
Absolutely.
Most parents might be just a bit concerned if their 16-year-old son suddenly acquired a high-performance sports car. Sue Evans, however, had much more to worry about when it came to her son, Andy. Seeing him roar around in a Lotus meant a little respite from constant anxiety about how long he had to live.
Just after he'd done his GCSEs, he just suddenly started developing infections which wouldn't respond to ordinary antibiotics. So he would have to go into hospital and have intravenous antibiotics, which used to burn his veins, and he stopped eating.
You must have feared for him enormously at this stage.
It was absolutely awful. 5 years that he was ill. Our life kind of went on hold, really.
Like many other people at that time, he'd been given blood products as part of his treatment for haemophilia, which were contaminated with HIV and hepatitis viruses. Andy has been at the forefront of a campaign to secure justice for himself and thousands of others, many who have not survived, affected by what's been called the worst scandal in NHS history. Next week, he'll give evidence at the Infected Blood inquiry. It's an opportunity his friends and family know he's long hoped for.
I'm getting a sense from Andrew that he really feels like the wind has changed. He's tough as boots, so I don't think he will crumble under the pressure ever.
He has always been the voice of such positivity, and that is what makes him completely remarkable. We met at the opening of the inquiry and we were still saying the same things. How did we get here? Because it felt so futile for so long.
The struggle against what often seemed like futile odds began very soon after Andy was born in 1977, as his mother Sue recalls.
Andy was 11 months old and he'd been standing in a travelling cot, rocking backwards and forwards. And that night, changing his nappy, and as I lifted his legs up, he screamed in pain. So we took him into hospital and they kept him in, saying they thought he might have a dislocated hip. And the next day they decided to perform surgery. When he came back from surgery, the medical staff said it was not a dislocated hip, it was a haematoma, big clot around the hip. And we've been looking at his bruising, and it seems to us that he's a battered baby. Absolutely devastating. And I think it was 2 or 3 days later that they found out that Andrew had actually got haemophilia.
And that meant problems with the clotting of his blood and regular hospital stays for transfusions. There were shortages of blood and blood products in the UK at the time, but new treatments have been emerging, many imported from abroad, which media reports suggested would make it all much more manageable.
This injection will stop Kevin bleeding. His blood will never clot naturally because one vital ingredient is missing. It's called factor VIII. The injection puts it back into his blood. It means he won't bleed into his joints and grow up crippled.
And so Andy Evans, as a young child, began a routine of injections and regular hospital checkups. Fellow patients at the time included a boy who became Andy's closest friend. He's chosen not to be a public figure, so we'll call him John. He remembers young Andy already showing signs of an irrepressible spirit and courage, deciding, for example, to do his own injections before he was 3 years old.
He injected himself, quite impressive. Before, oh, God, we're all going to be made to do that now. And we were. Andy, I think, was very much a pioneer in that. There was definitely a camaraderie, definitely an element of mischief. Get up to stuff.
What are we talking about?
Surgical gloves make great water bombs. That's all I'm going to say.
But enjoyment of that spirit was soon mixed, for Andy's mother Sue, with new anxieties. Doubts emerged about the safety of new imported blood clotting agents, including factor VIII.
When Andrew was probably about 5 or 6, my husband read an article in a magazine called The New Scientist that was pointing out that there could be some problem with factor VIII in America because the recipients were becoming ill. American factor VIII was made from blood products donated by anybody, and people really that didn't look after their health very well.
And your assumption, presumably all along, had been this would be a product, so presumably it had been through all kinds of tests and all kinds of controls that would ensure it was safe for treatment.
Well, we had hoped so, yes. We had a meeting one evening with the consultant, and I stood up and said, "Can you tell me if there is a problem with the factor 8, that children might get AIDS from it?" And I remember his exact words. He said, "Mrs. Evans, let me assure you that your son is more likely to get arthritis through not having factor 8 than of getting AIDS through having factor 8.
But many batches of the blood products used by Andy and thousands of others had indeed been contaminated by blood donors with hepatitis and HIV, which could develop into AIDS. That meant a few years later a very different conversation with those supervising Andy's care.
Andy was 9, and the consultant drew me aside after a clinic and said, "I'm very sorry to tell you, but Andrew's been infected with HIV." We decided not to tell him at that point. He was only 9, until he got to the point where the doctor thought that he ought to be put on anti-HIV drugs, and that's when we told him.
At what age was he then?
13. He said, "Well, I think I'd better become a scientist then and find a cure, hadn't I?" Hardly ever spoke about it, just carried on as normal as he could, and took the drugs which made him vomit on the school bus.
Several years later, Andy was informed by letter that he'd also been infected with hepatitis C, threatening major liver damage. His instinct, says his younger sister Katie, has always been to enjoy life and friendship to the full, whatever his state of health.
I was very jealous of my brother's wheelchair. He had a blue one with stickers all over it, and I always wanted a pink one. He was very adept at handling his wheelchair. He'd just do wheelies constantly up and down the driveway at home. And I've got a very vivid memory of him at school actually going from one end of the playground to the other with about 3 or 4 kids on the back of it, just all going down the hill together.
But AIDS in the mid-1980s was surrounded by much social stigma. His parents feared he might lose his friends and be ostracised if his condition was widely known.
I think they had said to him to not tell anybody, including me. There was a moment I remember in the backseat of the car being driven off to the shops one day, and I was messing around and trying to poke him and annoy him. And he kept saying, "Just don't touch me, I've got AIDS," he said. And I remember this term being quite shocking. I knew it was something terrible. Nobody knew how this disease played out. We were told he was probably going to have about 3 weeks left to live and he should make his final preparations at that point. I remember him telling me afterwards that he never gave up on himself. Even when the doctors were saying to him, "This is it, this is the last time," he wanted to keep on fighting.
Only those like his friend John, facing the same enormous challenges, were able fully to understand how all that felt.
A lot of the guys that we both know, they died. So, to sort of still have Andy with us is quite miraculous, really, because if I think back now to all the people that me and Andy knew, more have passed away than are still with us. So that makes that bond sort of even more special, actually.
And the boys who'd once used surgical gloves as water bombs now shared as adults a kind of dark humour.
We'd all been away as a group, all of us who were affected by haemophilia and HIV. We were all put up in a hotel, and there was another group there, and it was a convention of funeral directors. After several drinks, we were trying to negotiate a group rate on funeral plans.
Do you remember the response of the funeral directors?
I think there was a sort of a dignified, "Yes, we'll look into that."
Friendship of that kind, where anything could be said, was all the more precious while other relationships were overshadowed by his life-threatening infection. Andy's sister, Katie.
I know he had a girlfriend when he was 16, and I believe that as soon as he revealed his health status to her, she ended things, and I think she even said she didn't want to see or hear from him again, which I think was really painful for him. I don't think he was able to really have relationships on the agenda again until he was in his early 20s and eventually met a new lady who he was engaged to.
And she was in the United States?
Yeah, that's right. He actually upped and moved out there to be with her, and they were due to get married. But unfortunately, she also had HIV from a blood transfusion, and unfortunately she passed away a couple of years after they met. And unfortunately my dad was ill around the same time as well, so he passed away 2 weeks after Irene died. So yeah, very difficult.
Given all that's happened to Andy, the temptation to withdraw into the closest, most defensive kind of private life must have been great. He's now happily married to Michelle, and they have 3 children. And his mother, Sue, remembers a moment when another door opened.
He suddenly said one day, I'm going to Brighton for the weekend. I said, oh yes. He said, yeah, there's a haemophilia meeting down there, and I think it's time I did something. And he came back, absolutely buzzing, and said, they want me to help out, they want me to do talks, they want me to do this, that and the other. And from that weekend, he really didn't look back. He just laid himself open, really. In fact, more invigorated, I think.
There'd been an attempt by the authorities, as Andy himself recalled in an interview, to counter the campaign by offering the victims of the scandal limited payments without accepting liability.
In 1990, we took the NHS to court. It was my parents at the time.
Right.
People were dropping like flies, and so they came up with an out-of-court settlement in which we were forced to sign waivers, basically saying that we wouldn't sue for any further future.
You can't go back for more money.
Indeed, yeah.
Since then, the pressure for full compensation, as well as investigation of who was to blame, has intensified. And Andy Evans's personal campaigning style has been distinctive and highly effective. Sunday Times journalist Caroline Wheeler has been following the campaign for many years.
Anybody would forgive any of these people for being angry and bitter and furious with the treatment that they've had, but never him. He's always been very calm, very measured, willing to offer you answers, advice, guidance on where to go next. And even when I saw him at the opening of the inquiry, he was just very understated. There was nothing about him, big I am, I'm somebody that's helped bring this about, although he is. He's always taken it with such great dignity and such great poise.
There's a huge amount of empathy for what he's saying. You kind of get alongside him because he is such a compelling witness.
Diana Johnson MP is one of the politicians persuaded by direct contacts with the victims of the scandal to press for the public inquiry.
He tells his story in such a way that you can't help but listen and think, goodness, we need to do something about this. The one thing I know about Andy is the persistence. There's been so many knockbacks and government saying, well, we'll do a little bit, we'll give you a little bit of money or a new scheme. But actually, it's the persistence of saying, no, we want to know what happened. We want that public inquiry. We want to be properly compensated for what's happened to us.
It's been such a rollercoaster ride since the inquiry was announced. And I've been speaking to lots of people here and it's just hit them like a juggernaut. For those of us who are still alive, we need to have that closure before we can actually move on with the rest of our lives.
If nothing does come from it, I think it'll be a real blow for him. Well, it will for all of them.
And alongside it all must be a sense of the people he has known who haven't survived.
Absolutely. He went to another funeral just 3 weeks ago, I think. And I think since the inquiry was announced, something like 150 people have died. None of us know whether our loved ones will still be here at the end of the inquiry. We just go from day to day and hope that everything will work out as well as it can, really.
Andy Evans will give evidence next week using the public inquiry to place on record the scandal's human cost. The group he co-founded, Tainted Blood, takes as its motto words from the philosopher Voltaire. To the living we owe respect. To the dead we owe only the truth.
Profile was presented by Chris Bowlby. The producer was Smita Patel.